Hello and welcome to episode 15 of Track Records with your hosts Kenny and Barry, where we discuss all things music. And speaking of which, Barry, you were tuning us into some of your favorite recent listenings. And one of the ones you'd mentioned was the soundtrack to Orca, a movie long forgotten, but you said it's a soundtrack not so great, but still worth a listen. And for those of you who are not familiar with Ennio Morricone, and shame on you if you're not, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, movie composers ever. This is the CD or the album collection that I would recommend you start with, which is the Ennio Morricone anthology. And so it will really give you an idea of all his different types of music. Do you agree with
And
that? Do you have this?
as a side note,
Yeah.
that that actual copy that you're holding in your hand, it's called a fistful of film music.
Yes.
So that you were responsible for turning me on to Morricone in the first place with that very
With that one.
same compilation when we were both living in San Francisco, and it would have been 94, 95-ish. You loaned that to me and I recorded it onto a cassette, and that began my love affair with Ennio Morricone. So that's kind of funny that you actually just happened to bring that up, because it's that very copy that
That's
you hold in
excellent.
your hands.
And I was so excited when that came out because it's an excellent anthology. And
It's
it's
great.
interesting going back to like our talk about why music is so important and how you get into music. I think you just locked onto something there, which is it's so transferable. I lent you the CD, then you taped it, and now you had a copy, and then it can go from there. And then someone might even like you might be playing it for someone else. They're like, oh, cool, let me get a copy of that, and so forth. In the way that like yeah, as great as books are, like if I lend you a book, you then give it back to me when you're done, hopefully. And that's it. And like you don't have a copy and you only have your memory. And so I think there's also that when it comes to music and I guess movies as well, but in terms of like always circulating like that. And I mentioned before that at one point I was friends with a guy who owned this huge used record store, um, uh, and uh, and he would, for a small fee, he would tape stuff from his private collection for me.
Yeah, that was that store in Boston that
Yeah,
you've talked about.
yeah.
No longer there, I assume.
They had two locations. One is closed, and I think one is still open. It's called In Your Ear, and Reed was the name of the owner. And my sister's old boyfriend, Manny, worked there at the time, and it was just down the street from Boston University. So I could just stroll down there and always pick up stuff and all. And the stuff I could get him to tape were all sorts of rarities, bootlegs, stuff like that that I couldn't otherwise get a hold of. So it was pretty cool. I would love to have had the original, but it was great just to have, any sort of recording.
So that would be stuff that only the hardcore fan, such as yourself, would be interested in.
Yeah.
The rarities and bootlegs and that sort of stuff.
I remember how.
Fanatics like you have to
Yes,
have those.
I,
Me
I
too.
was I was so excited when I tracked down the bootleg of the Doors album in Miami, where Morrison gets busted. That was a prized part of my collection back then.
For supposedly whipping out his penis,
Yes,
which in fact he
lewd
did not
behavior.
do. According to the legend, the rest of the Doors have talked about it since then, and he actually didn't whip it out. He just said he was going to, and it caused just the hint of doing it caused such a uproar that cops immediately swarmed the stage. And according to the Doors, the other Doors, he actually did not pull out his dick.
Well, it's funny because like Ray Manzarek and Morrison were close, and Ray seems to have always had a sort of, say la vie attitude towards Morrison's behavior. Robbie Krieger, a little less accepting. John Densmore, when you'd see him interviewed afterwards, when Morrison's name would come up, you'd see Denmore's veins starting to like just pop. Like it obviously drove him fucking crazy playing with Morrison. So
Had less tolerance for
yeah,
his shenanigans.
so
But it's kind of a double-edged sword, because a lot of those shenanigans are what made the Doors as famous and as successful as they were. So
yeah.
I wonder if Densmore actually held back a little bit because of that. Back then when all that stuff was going on, maybe he just let it slide because he knew he would benefit from it too. Who knows? Who knows?
Yeah. No, and I'm also talking more about interviews with him after Morrison was passed,
Sure,
where he'd
sure.
like think back, and you could see even I was thinking back, you could see him starting to bristle.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you could say, be careful what you wish for, because if he wasn't Mr. Mojo Rising, they wouldn't have been, nearly successful as they were. So
And we wouldn't be talking about him or them right now on
yeah,
this very important podcast.
yes. So pour one out for Jim wherever he is, Pierre Lachaise or whatever the name of that cemetery is
I've
in
been there.
Paris. I've
I've
been
been
there
to his
too.
grave.
Yep.
Yeah,
So
who hasn't
yep.
in their early 20s? If you've been
Yep.
to Paris, you made the pilgrimage to that
Yes, of
place.
course. So pretty funny. And so I also listened to a couple of the albums you mentioned last time.
Hmm.
One was the Elbows Audio Vertigo, and
Hmm.
the other was the Herbie Hancock. What was it called?
Inventions and dimensions.
Inventions and Dimensions. And that again is on the one, like, it's sort of funny like how you think of it. So the fact that I was able to listen to those things right after we talked was so cool that I could do that. And I wonder, because I might have thought of it this way back when I was a record collector the way you are, do you see that as cheating in any way?
No, I
Like,
don't.
okay.
That's just, that's just a fact. That's how most people acquire and listen to music these days. And I can totally appreciate the convenience of it. That said, um, when you go out and buy records and play records, and there is such a different level of engagement that to me it carries more weight. But I don't begrudge you or anybody else for being able to just go download shit and
And
listen to it, 15 minutes later. That's great.
it, the immediacy is just amazing. And because let's say I recommend an album to you, which you thought you're really, interested in getting, you would still have to go out. You'd have to go to a record store. You'd have to, find that particular record. In particular, if it was something, not obscure, but something more like not, not in main printing.
Mhm.
It might take you a while, and you'd have to be determined to go get it. And who knows if you would or wouldn't, and who knows if you'd be lucky enough to find it. And so it's just amazing.
Yeah, yeah, it's different. And to your point, that search and rescue mission,
Yes.
so to speak, is what I don't know, which for me it makes it more compelling. The whole I hate to use that word journey, but the whole music listening and indulging experience has more gravitas, if you will,
I
if you're
agree.
out searching for records.
Even though I'm not that person anymore, I completely agree. And if you told me when I was that person that I'd become the person I am now, I would have said never going to happen, because I really enjoyed being part of that, treasure hunter club.
Mhm. Which is
And
what it is essentially.
yeah, and I really enjoyed it. And I've talked about certain, rare finds I've gotten and how excited I was and all. And I wish it could still be like that. As I've said, several moves, cross country moves have just eliminated the ability for me to keep my record collection together. And then now just finding, just so much easier to just, have everything streamed, in particular because you can stream everything. If I
Mhm.
could only stream 5% of, the stuff we talk about, or 10%, then I'd be like, okay, I can't, I have to have access. But it's unbelievable, what you can get.
Yeah. Majority rules, and the majority of people listen to music via streaming, so it makes sense.
And it's really had an impact on bands. It's a whole different way to go and way to approach it. Like it used to be, that in particular, like I'm sure it shows that when you guys did shows, you would have your albums or your CDs for available at the merch table, and maybe bands still do that, but maybe
They
not.
do.
I mean,
They
okay,
do.
you know,
So there's usually with the rise in vinyl listening these days, there's always a handful of records at a merch table for those people who have gotten into vinyl. Usually, it's younger people who have gotten into it over the last 10 years or so, and then old farts such as myself. But it's still a very um, small segment of the fan base, I think, for the
it,
most part.
It's funny when Kim and I lived in Arlington, just outside of Cambridge, Massachusetts. There was a typewriter repair shop across the street from us, and he's now the guy's finally now retiring, and he's looking to sell the shop, but he wants to find someone who's qualified at typewriter repair, which is not easy. And he said though that he said it's a lot of young people who are like want to get away from computers and are getting back into typewriters.
Hmm.
So it's interesting to see that, that the same thing with vinyl. Like vinyl, I understand typewriters. That's like wow. um, but I'd be curious if you like the next 10 people you meet, if you said, "How do you listen to music?" I'm and like not your close friends, not your hardcore vinyl friends, but just 10 the next 10 random people you meet. I would guess the majority is streaming now.
Oh, for sure,
Yeah.
for sure. There's no doubt. Yeah, yeah. And speaking of which, speaking of vinyl,
Yes.
before we were so rudely interrupted with our last episode, um, I was touching base on some recent records that I'd picked up and have been listening to, and was just walking through some of them.
Yep.
So you want to continue on with some of
Yep.
those?
Please.
I have a handful more.
Yep.
In fact, I buy so many records that we could do this for probably the next 10 episodes nonstop with just records I picked up recently.
And
But
those are you're doing in person or by mail?
both,
Okay.
both. I go to record shows, record stores around here, and when I'm traveling, I always go to record stores. But I do get a lot online as well,
Got it.
um, from that little company called Amazon.
I've
I'm
heard of them.
plugging them because they could probably use a little help.
Yes.
So the last one I brought up was this Eno
Yeah.
record called Lux, and it's another one of his ambient efforts. So he started doing this series of records in the mid to late 70s that are basically all instrumental, and they're ambient. So they're made to be on when you're at home and perhaps you're doing the dishes or cooking dinner or waking up drinking coffee. They're very sparse, very ethereal, and he's done just a boatload of them, and I love them. I love every one of them. Uh, this is a perfect example of a record I will listen to in the morning when I'm drinking coffee and just waking up and chilling out. They're always just beautiful pieces of music and very unique. There's a lot of, I guess there's others out there, but Eno was the one who started this type of music, and there are imitators, but stick with him if you want the best ambient music out there.
And it's interesting though, he actually at one point had one sort of minor hit, not ambient, which was Babies on Fire, back in I guess the mid 70s.
72.
Okay. And what album was that on?
It was called "Here Come the Warm
The Warm
Jets."
Jets.
It was
That's
it
it. Yeah.
was his first proper solo record. He
Yeah.
he he put out one before that with Robert Fripp, which was basically tape loops, guitar tape loops. But I'm pretty sure that "Here Come the Warm Jets" was his first proper record, and it wasn't an ambient record. It
No,
was
it's
a
not.
rock record.
Yeah. And I think that's a great record.
Oh, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
His rock records I like even more than the ambient records. Those first 4 or 5 records of his that came out in the early to mid 70s, all of them, I just love them to death.
And while I as I've mentioned before, I do like the later efforts of Roxy Music in a different way from the earlier stuff, but I do really like them. But the first couple albums when Eno was with the band, that's when Roxy Music was at its best.
Yeah, I would agree. And when he left Roxy Music and started putting out his own records, I think that Roxy Music sound was somewhat of a blueprint for his own records. There's a lot of similarities, even though Eno technically doesn't really play any instruments.
Right.
What did they call him? Sound processor, I think was like in the credits on those first couple Roxy Music records. I think
Right.
that's what it was. It was sound processor, because he really isn't a musician, and he'll be the first one to say that, which is so weird in the sense that he puts out such beautiful records and he really can't even play anything. It's crazy.
There's still hope for me yet. It is strange, but I think he was an important counterpoint to Brian Ferry, because Ferry would go more the romantic route, which he did once Eno left, and I think Eno kept him more made it,
quirky.
yeah, and made the music more avant-garde. And again, I like the
Yeah,
romantic stuff, but the avant-garde stuff is, stuff like Editions of You, just, just a different sound. So
in every home, what is it? In
in
every
every
home,
home a heartache. Yeah,
yeah, in every dream home, a heartache.
yeah,
Yeah,
which is
yeah,
ode to a blow-up doll. Yeah.
yes, exactly. When you're talking about romantic, so
Yeah.
yeah, that song is basically about being in love with a blow-up doll.
Yeah.
And let's just say after Eno left the band, there wasn't a lot of songs about blow-up dolls or anything that
No,
quirky.
and stuff like Mother of Pearl, that's when they went more in the direction of like Love is the Drug, which is a good song and I like it,
Mhm,
but it's just
mhm.
not nearly as interesting as their earlier stuff. And in some ways, actually, I like the later end romantic stuff more than the mid stuff. So like my favorite Roxy music is early, and then next would be late, and then last would be the middle.
So do you know the records Stranded,
Yep.
Country Life,
Yep. All of them.
and Siren?
Manifesto. Yep.
Well, Manifesto is a little later, but
Yep.
those are the three that came right after Eno left.
Yep.
And I love those almost as much as the first couple. Even though Eno's not there, there's still enough quirkiness and enough of that original Roxy music sound that I love those records.
And I would actually prefer Avalon to Country Life, for example. But it's hard to like, they're different albums. They're so different that
Mhm.
it's hard to compare. It's apples and oranges.
They're a great example of a band that continued to experiment and progress and change, as opposed to, like, sure, maybe they could have kept doing the same art rock over and over again, but they really evolved into something different. When you compare, like, say, their very first record to something like Avalon, I mean,
Yeah.
hard to believe it's even the same band.
Very, and it's interesting that for most of those years, Brian Ferry was doing solo albums, releasing solo albums along at the same time, and yet
Mhm,
that's an example of where they never interfered with the band. He didn't go solo until like leave Roxy Music to go solo to way late in
mhm,
his career. As opposed to the way it was we touched on briefly before with Rod Stewart and the Faces, where Rod always had a foot up the door, ready to go and start a solo career.
mhm.
Ferry releasing solo albums never seemed to interfere with Roxy Music, and Ferry solo albums are great. So
Yes, they are. In particular, the ones that came out um, during that initial period of Roxy Music in the mid '70s. They actually, if you listen to them, they actually sound basically like Roxy Music albums from that era. But they're all, and a lot of the guys from Roxy Music played on them,
yeah, and
hence
they
instead of
tend to
sounding like that.
be more covers. These Foolish Things was one of my favorite albums of his, and I think it's almost all covers. But
That one, I think you're right, and an odd thing that he did on one of his solo records, there's about 3 or 4 Roxy Music songs that had come out in the year or two prior, and he actually covered those on his own solo record, which is a really strange thing to do.
yeah,
And they're great versions
yeah,
of them. That record is called "Let's Stick Together,"
yeah,
and
yeah,
one of my favorites of his for sure.
and that also has, I believe, a copy of cover of Al Green's "Take Me to the River."
Is it that one?
Yeah, I think it's on that one.
Yeah.
So
Um. Anyway, next record. Do you know this record, "The Black Rider" by Tom Waits?
nope. I obviously I'm quite familiar with Tom Waits and his catalog, but not with that one. What year is that?
93.
Okay.
And I've had this on CD forever, and was waiting for it to finally be reissued on record, and it finally was recently. And they did a great job of remastering it and
So you want it on
packaging
rec
it
you want it on record for collecting purposes, or because you think it sounds better?
because it sounds better.
Okay.
And CDs are fine. I'll listen to them in my car, but I never listen to them at home for the most part. So this was a real treat for me because I'd been waiting for years. When I was in England, I bought a bootleg version of this on vinyl
Yeah.
when Suzanne and I were in England like 7, 8 years ago, and it was it was kind of expensive, but that's how badly I wanted it on vinyl, and it was a mistake because it doesn't sound very good. It wasn't mastered from the original tapes like this is. It was mastered from a CD. So it basically sounds like a CD with a few cracks and pops and snaps and crackles. Um, but this is basically a soundtrack to a play that he wrote with this playwright Robert Wilson. You've probably
Yep.
heard of him.
Yep. Yep.
And I think it's one of his most underrated records. It's from that classic, quirky late 80s, mid 80s to mid 90s Tom Waits period where, in my view, he could do no wrong. Um, and I don't think it gets the accolades that it deserves. It came out right after Bone Machine, which was a record that a lot of people look at as his best record. Um, I think I like this one more.
That's interesting. Uh, if any, actually, I like every Tom Waits album I've heard. I like. So no knock in any of his albums that I've heard. Although he's released many more albums than I've heard. But I like his early stuff probably like as much as Swordfish and Trombones. Early album, Small Change, I believe it was called.
Mhm,
Late 70s,
mhm.
and more sparse, and more just piano music and again, I as much as like Frank's Wild Years and again the later stuff, I really like that early stuff. But
Yeah, I've heard a lot of friends say that that it's that barfly persona, drunken uh, piano lounge guy act that was basically the basis for that character of his on his first handful of records,
yeah,
like Small Change, um, or what are some of the other ones? Blue Valentine,
yeah,
Foreign Affairs, Heart Attack and Vine. And I know other friends who prefer that to his later period or middle period, which was started with that Swordfish Trombones record, where he made a concerted effort to completely revamp his sound, get rid of that old barfly lounge singer persona. And that all started with Swordfish Trombones. And that was in collaboration with his new relationship and who ended up becoming his wife, Kathleen Brennan. She apparently was a big inspiration for him as far as changing his sound to grow and evolve, just like we were talking about earlier with Roxy Music.
yeah, and he
That's a
did.
major evolution.
Yep. And I don't know if this has anything to do with it, but an interesting story that he told was he met with Bukowski before the movie Barfly came out, and they wanted him to be the character, to play Bukowski, the character Mickey Rourke eventually did. And he was such a fan of Bukowski's, he said, I can't do it.
Couldn't do it justice.
Yeah, and it's in, and I wonder, I don't know about the timing of that story when that happened, but it'd be interesting if that also helped like him change his, his image, his music, and go in a different direction.
That movie came out, I think, a little later
Did it? Okay.
than
So
Swordfish Trombones.
yeah, I couldn't tell the timeline. So
Um, next, uh, Elvin Jones, Polycurrents, um, jazz drummer,
yeah,
supreme. My favorite jazz drummer, hands down. He played all those years with Coltrane in his classic quartet with McCoy Tyner, Jimmy Garrison, Elvin, and Coltrane. But anyway, he put out a lot of solo records on his own. And this is from, I think, 1970 and is one of his best records. If you like jazz, this is another one of those records that's not a super difficult listen. And great drumming on it and some other percussion. And he was a composer as well as a drummer. So he composed a lot of the tunes. And his wife at the time, who was Japanese, she was a great jazz pianist in her own right. And one of her songs is on this, Polycurrents. Can't go wrong with it.
don't know that. Was lucky enough to see him. Saw the McCoy Tyner Quartet at the Regatta Bar in Cambridge, and he was on drums. And that was as close as I've come to Coltrane, in person, in terms of seeing him and seeing McCoy Tyner. And they were great. It was different, obviously, not having trained sound, there. I can't remember who was playing sax at the time, but yeah, I thought Elvin Jones was a tremendous
I
drummer.
I think it was Kenny G, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Um, you could tell we're around the same age and hardcore music fans because out of the original quartet, Coltrane quartet, I saw Elvin Jones and I saw McCoy Tyner
Yeah.
at this place called Jazz Alley in Seattle. So it's just funny that we have that in common and we've never discussed that.
There was a year or so, basically, of my life where I listened to nothing but jazz. That was it, just
Mhm.
jazz, and went to jazz shows all the time. That's also when Ornette Coleman released his I can't remember the album, not Songs in the Key of X, but something along that title. So I got to see Ornette Coleman. I got to see a lot of people I otherwise wouldn't have seen. Sonny Rollins, Miles Davis, and there was also a year of my life where I just listened to nothing but country. So it was
Yeah.
strange having a year of just an entire year of listening to nothing but country, and a year where I listened to nothing but jazz. I also worked at a place called the Center for Survey Research. I worked there for about a year, just doing menial data entry type stuff. But one of the guys I met, this guy Steve Shaker, was a musician, and he was a huge jazz fan, and he turned me on to all sorts of stuff that I didn't know, like Gene Ammons and Horace Silver and numerous others. And if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have like had the love of jazz I developed.
So let me ask you this. Was it a concerted effort to listen to only jazz, or that's just what you were feeling, and
And that's what I was
that's
feeling.
the music you wanted to hear,
Yep,
and nothing but that?
that's what I was
That's
feeling.
interesting,
Yeah,
because that's quite a left turn
yeah.
from your musical origins of rock and punk and post punk whatever to all of a sudden listen to nothing. Like, did it happen like one Friday you're like, okay, tomorrow I'm listening to nothing but jazz for the
No,
next
it was
year?
it wasn't conscious. And maybe I listened to a handful of other, some rock and roll over the course of it, but really, nothing that I recall. Okay, I was just like so into jazz and looking for, and that's during my record collecting days, still the later end of my record collecting days. So I was now looking for jazz albums all the time. And since I had so many rock albums, like I hadn't bought a lot of jazz albums, so now here's a whole new world to explore. So there's so many more albums I could buy, because like, unlike, oh, I've got that Stones album, I've got that Who album, I've got that Doors album, I've got that Blondie album or whatever, but now a whole world of jazz records I didn't have. And it's the same thing when I really got into country, and I mean old country. I'm not a new country fan,
I
but
know. I that's a given.
yes, but suddenly there was Hank Williams and Johnny Cash, and all sorts of old country music. And again, I didn't have those albums. And Tammy Wynette, I'm a big Tammy Wynette fan.
Hmm.
And so George Jones is one of my favorite singers of all times. So,
Hmm. He's amazing.
and so,
Um, so I had a very similar experience when I started getting into jazz as well. It wasn't exclusively jazz like you, but it did feel like, oh my God, here's this whole new world of music to explore, and music that I just, even to this day, and even being sort of a hack musician myself, I can't wrap my head around how good jazz musicians are and how they play what they play. It's just mind-boggling, the dexterity that it takes to play good jazz. And to this day, I love it, and that's one of the main reasons why I like jazz so much, because it is like, I just don't quite understand it. Rock music, it's like, okay, yeah,
yeah,
you know, I get it and I understand it and I understand what they're doing and what they're trying to do, but jazz is just like from another fucking planet to me,
it is.
in a
And
good
like,
way.
yeah, like listening to Charlie Parker stuff, man, it's just amazing. And that's the other thing about jazz I love, just how different the early stuff towards the mid stuff, later stuff. The Ken Burns documentary on jazz is so worth seeing. It's just fantastic, especially the first two episodes, where we're dealing with the origin of jazz,
Yeah, it's great.
in New Orleans in the early 1900s and all. But then, like, again with Louis Armstrong, with Dizzy Gillespie, with Charlie Parker, and then later with Miles and Train. I mean, it's just, again, I love jazz. I'm always amazed when you meet someone, you say, so what type of music do you like? And they say, oh, all types. And I'm
except
like, really? They
jazz.
say all types. And I'll go, oh, do you like jazz? They're like, no, not jazz. Oh, do you like
Yeah.
classical? No, not classical. Opera? No, definitely not opera. Hip hop? No, not. They mean they like classic rock, and that's all it is,
That's funny.
But
That's
they like to think they like everything.
yeah.
I love opera music. One of the great things was when I was working on Wall Street and I could go to the Met and see Don Giovanni. It was just amazing. I'm actually a big opera fan. It's just nothing I do these days because it doesn't really exist in Austin. And also, when you do go see it in New York, Boston, Los Angeles, it is not very affordable. So
So I got to ask you, you were going to opera during your broker days. So were you gambling, doing lines of coke, and trading by day, and then getting all hopped up and getting over to the Metropolitan Opera House to see, I don't know, Maria Callas?
it's so let me just say that so you'd ask for tickets. You'd say, I need tickets for this, I need tickets for that, I'm taking a client to this, I'm taking a client to that. So often people wanted tickets for the Rangers, the Islanders, the Knicks or whatever. I was definitely one of the only people who I not one of the only, I was the only person who would ask for tickets to go to the Met. And actually to drag my boss one time, he brought his brother and his mother was like the bride of Frankenstein. She was really bizarre. And it was just funny to bring them there because it was so not their milieu. But yeah, my dad was a huge Mozart fan to the point where when he and my mom were on a trip to Europe and I was not supposed to get a dog, I went and got a dog and I was like, he's gonna kill me. And I was, I know, I'll name him Amadeus. That'll work.
It,
And indeed it did.
it
Um,
softened the blow.
yes. But yeah, my dad liked rock and roll a lot. And he liked singer-songwriters like Gordon Lightfoot. But he was a big classical music fan. And I'm sorry I didn't listen to it more. He was definitely ready to turn me on to, Mahler's Seventh Symphony and the Goldberg variations by Bach and again Don Giovanni and because of the relationship he and I had, which was very mercurial, I was more, no, I'm not interested, you know. And then later on, of course, I was like, oh my God, you know,
Should have taken advantage of
yeah.
that.
It's like Mark Twain once said, when I was 14, I thought my father was the stupidest person alive. And by the time I turned 21, I couldn't believe how much he'd learned in the last 7 years.
Yeah, that's such a great line.
So,
And going back to you had mentioned you listened to that new Elbow record.
yep.
Um, so last week I had said that I think it's their best record. I've listened to it a few more times, and I have to offer a retraction. It's not their best record, but it's really good, and I like it a lot. I think I was so excited by it after listening to it the first couple times. Now that it's been a few more spins, it's really good, but certainly not their best. I would say maybe their fourth or fifth best, in fact, after listening to it more.
And I think that can happen. And I think, like excitement because it's a new album, or like newly purchased. I also think mood or where you are in life at the time, can have an effect because there are albums where I was like I loved as soon as I heard, and then later on I was like, it's good, but and vice versa. Where album I heard and I was like, it's all right, and then later on I was like, wait, that album's fucking brilliant. What was wrong with me?
That's usually how it goes for me. It's
Yeah.
usually it takes a few spins and then suddenly it clicks for whatever reason. Maybe you're listening to it more closely or whatever, but rarely does it go the other way around where I'm super jazzed about something and then suddenly it's like, actually, it's not as good as I thought it was. So it's kind of strange.
Yeah, I think that is more unusual, but it's so awesome. I remember dropping the needle on "Pleased to Meet Me" by the Replacements, and the album just kicks off with "IOU" and it just comes blasting out, and then goes into Alex Chilton, and I was like, "Oh my God!" I was like, it was such an effect on me, like
Mhm.
that, and I still think the album's a great album, but in repeated listenings, it's not quite as good as I thought it was then. But it just blew me away at the time, to the point where like if you'd asked me that day, the first day I heard it, I would have said it's the greatest album of all time. And it's
and
not. It's
and in
it's a good
fact,
album.
it's not even as good as the two that came right before it,
Yes.
in my
So
opinion.
yeah,
I bet you agree too that Let It Be and Tim are better than Pleased to Meet Me.
probably. Although I Alex Chilton's my favorite song of theirs, and so it has a leg up for that reason. But yeah, as an album, probably so. Although their best title album was definitely "Sorry Ma Forgot to Take Out the Trash." That was a great name for an album. So
Um,
and I like
Next,
Hootenanny a lot too. So
you know this record.
yes, I had that record. Yep.
So uh, Nico's definitely not everybody's cup of tea.
No.
This record was recently. I have an original copy of it, but it's kind of thrash. So this came out recently with a bonus 7-inch with some non-LP tracks. That's the sort of shit that I go for with reissues.
Yeah.
And I wanted a clean copy of the record. It's Nico the Marble Index. It's her second solo record. It came after um, the first
Chelsea
one.
Girl.
Yes, Chelsea Girl. This one is a complete departure. That first record is the record company trying to make her into a bit of a pop
Yeah.
chanteuse.
Yeah.
Um, there was
I like
a
it though. But yeah.
I do too. I
Yeah.
love it. I
Yeah.
love it. But man,
Yeah.
this is the real deal. This and everything she did after this record. This was produced by John Cale, by the way, from the
Yeah.
Velvet Underground.